And so welcome everyone to our conference, which is to mark the 30 years of the Disability Discrimination Act, which became law in 1995. And our evening today, we're going to kind of look back to that time with some of our guests who are going to be part of the first panel. I'm really excited to have a conversation with all of them. And then after that, there's going to be a presentation on this idea of the UK Accessibility Act. And then there will be an opportunity for you to work in breakout rooms and give us your thoughts about that. So there'll be some interaction at the end. As I say, we'll make all of this available as a recording afterwards. So if you can't stay for the whole lot, or you'd like to rewatch it, then you'll be able to do that. So as we start, if I could ask our panel to be pinned, please, to the main screen. And just while that's being done, just because of the numbers of people that are going to be in this room in this session today, just please stay on silent unless someone is speaking. So always stay muted, keep your videos off. It just helps the system work better. And we want to make sure that only one person speaks at any one time, because we've got sign language interpretation happening and speech to text as well. And so if you do cut in over someone, it means that they can't translate and do the accessibility, and actually we can't hear either. So thank you for that. We've got a number of staff in the participant list that got the words, the letters DRUK after them. If you've got any problems, you're having technical problems, they're there to help you out. So they'll be monitoring the chat as we go along. I think this is all of us. So hello to Alan, Greg, Agnes, and David. Really pleased to be to have you join us today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I thought we'd start off with just you introducing yourself. Just who are you? And just tell us in like 1 minute, just something about you before we kind of get off into more of a conversation. So I'm going to kick off with David. David, over to you.
Can you hear me all right?
You can.
Great. Thanks very much, Cameron. And hello, everybody. My name is David Ruebain. I, ages ago, 40 plus years ago, probably, I was quite active in the disability movement. I was the vice chair of the Rights Now campaign. And I was also at that time, up until about 15 years ago, I was a practicing solicitor. So I did a lot of legal drafting and work for originally for Roger Berry, who was a backbench Labour MP who was trying to introduce anti-discrimination legislation for disabled people. And also I was a legal observer on demonstrations. So I was I suppose I was involved in the disability movement and the campaign for civil rights in that way. And now I work in higher education. I work at Sussex University.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Lovely to have you with us. I'm going to come to Agnes next.
Hi, Cameron. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Agnes Fletcher. These days, I'm a consultant on equity and inclusion issues. I'm also, well, I shouldn't apply this to David, but I'll say it just about myself, a bit of an antique, having been involved in disability rights work for just a little over 30 years, since about 1991, 92. And I was involved in some direct action, which we're going to hear about, very much as a sort of foot soldier, if you like, but also involved in the Rights Now campaign to supporting lobbies of Parliament and that sort of work. I worked in Parliament after the DDA, the 1995 bill, while I was at the Disability Rights Commission, but also way back in DRUK's history. A bit of it was called Radar, and I was the parliamentary officer there. So was involved in some of that work to try and improve on the DDA, which we'll come to all of that a bit later on as well, and work with Greg, who we'll hear from I'm sure in a minute, at the Disability Rights Commission for 6 years as well.
Thank you, Agnes. I'm going to come to Alan next, just because he's next on my screen.
Oh, hi guys. I'm Alan, sometimes known as Johnny Crescendo, a performer, but I did help organise the telethon demonstrations, which I think put disability from the health pages to the political pages, which obviously helped the DDA, right? Or the getting of the DDA. Dan was founded in, well, we had a meeting in 1993, I think, and we decided to go for accessible public transport. Other things were there like rights and welfare and so on. But in the end, we picked something which was easy, because, if you're going to get arrested, you might as well get arrested for jail for something. And so we went for lifts and buses and accessible public transport. But because we were so successful, we did play some part in the campaign for the DDA.
Brilliant. Lovely to have you with us, Alan.
Oh, yeah.
You haven't mentioned it, but if anyone is aware of the TV program when Barbara met Alan, it's on Netflix. So he's covering his face now. But
no. Go to Dan on Facebook. Right, go to Dan. That's the real story. Basically.
All right. Watch
Agnes
that
is in that. I think Agnes, you are in that, right?
Well, in the show, I'm not in the show. I don't think.
No. You're in Desperate Dan.
Desperate Dan, hopefully, yes.
Right.
There you go. So yeah.
And we'll put those links in the chat.
That's real.
Greg, over to you.
Hi, good evening. I'm Greg Smith. I came to the disability rights world quite late in life. I was early 30s when I joined the Disability Rights Commission as head of strategy, research and business planning, and spent 3.5 years there, working, as Agnes said, with Agnes. Since then, I've done various other things not related to disability rights. So currently my main work is around consulting in digital user experience for startups, government and corporates. But I've also rejoined the disability rights world in a trustee role, in terms of being a trustee at both Disability Rights UK and the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers.
Thank you, Greg. Lovely to have you all with us. Thank you so much for giving up your evening to talk about this topic, the DDA. So I was quite young when that came out. I remember it kind of coming, but I wasn't really involved in the kind of campaigning bit, the activism side. It was really not known to me. I was, I'd come to the UK from Pakistan, and so I wasn't really connected to that movement as such. So it's really interesting meeting people who were, and kind of the achievement. So Alan, I want to come to you first, really, just to kick us off. You mentioned the DAN, as you referred to, that's the Direct Action Network. So just kind of tell us what your and that network's involvement was, and what you were doing, and what led to that, and how that connects to the DDA from your perspective.
Sorry to come in. I really apologise. Could you just hold that question? Because I don't think the stream text is working. Who are the captioners?
The captioner's working on my screen.
The stream. Well, the stream, the external link to stream text.
So Sally is so Sally, it says. Oh no, sorry, not Sally.
Hi Cameron, this is Julia, one of the captioners. It is working. I'm watching it myself.
Could you put the link in the chat?
It's weird. The link.
I'll get the link again.
Okay. A lot of people, including myself, are just clicking on the link and it's not showing anything.
Okay.
Should people try show captions at the bottom? Is that?
Yeah, that's the same output. You could use that as well. Yeah.
Okay, so
I've repasted the link in the chat though.
Yes. So if you're having difficulty, click on show captions, everybody, at the bottom. and you'll get the same feed. Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. Thank you. It's important to get that right. Alan, would you like me to repeat the question, or have you kind of got it?
Yeah, please.
Repeat it. Yeah. So I was just asking, you mentioned Dan and what's the Direct Action Network. Just tell us a bit more about that and what led to that formation and your involvement in that, what it was doing. You talked about telethon and you said you picked transport and how that kind of led to and connects to the DDA becoming legislation.
Well, it began with me meeting people like Ken Davis from Derbyshire Coalition, who founded that. He founded the Disability Information Line and so on. And then I also met Mike Oliver, right, and talked about the social model. And I think I don't have to explain what a social model is, but basically it says we're being discriminated against. It's as simple as that. So if we're being discriminated against, and I'd been part of the anti-apartheid movement, where there was obviously serious discrimination going on, and there was serious discrimination going on with disabled people. So we needed to think about that, how they behave. I used to go to anti-apartheid demonstrations, CND demonstrations, and I thought, well, where's the disability demonstrations? And then I was living in, I won't go too far. Let's go to the telethon. And the ITV telethon was a big charity that patronized and misrepresented, just made us look like, crap, basically. And it was the easiest demonstration to organize, to be honest, right? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but trying to organize people to come to one place is hard. This was not hard at all. This was like, how many people can I bring? And, what time should I be there? It was like, and me and Barbara did that for 2 years. And, we had 1,000 people protesting against the studios. And on the first year, we went, oh, that's great. We never took any names. Right? We didn't make a list of who was there. So we had no way of contacting these people. But on the second year, we did. And then we had a meeting at the Disabled Drivers Association in Norwich. I asked Ken to chair it, Ken Davis, and he did. And we decided on what we were going to do. But before that meeting, me and Barbara had been to America and met ADAPT. And those leaders had like 500 people, and they had grassroots people, like real grassroots people. And it was like, you need to keep it simple. Keep it simple, stupid, basically. And, so we went for transport in the end. It was a narrow thing. We could have gone for rights. We could have gone for welfare. But in the end, we chose the simple option, which was transport. So we just decided to do transport. And then Rob Hayward in Christchurch, who had talked out a disability bill, was standing for the Member of Parliament in Christchurch. So our first action was really part of that DDA campaign, because all the people we got involved were so angry about this guy thinking he's going to win in Christchurch that we went down and basically we did some demonstration. We didn't get arrested. We marched on the high street. We followed him around all day. We got in the papers. We attracted attention, and he lost by 40,000 votes. So now we know that Danny is like political, right? We can affect politics. We'd already did it with telethon. And then after that, we just did transport until 1997. Right? In fact, in 1995, we hit Birmingham in, I think, October. So we weren't focused on the DDA. But because we were attracting attention by getting arrested and anchoring ourselves to buses, people who were in the leadership, who were in that kind of other group was saying, I remember Bert Massey, if you don't know who Bert Massey was, he rang me up on a Friday saying, hey, you know, there's a private members bill coming before Parliament on Monday, and you know, can we get a few people out? So we call them snap actions. You know, there was no organisation who can make it, who can come, right? And mostly London danners, but there were other people too. And, you know, so we were like kind of driven by them. Well, not by them, but we were asked by them. And it was so funny because like Bert Massey, who was in Radar, some of our members had been selling T-shirts with Rights Not Radar on them, because you know, we weren't really into charities at all. Right? We were into working together. Right. And he said, can you stop selling these? I said, no, you know, they're raising money, you know, they're raising a couple £100. And, you know, John Smith, if you're watching this, I'm loving you. He's from Northampton, right? And he was the guy who instigated that. But we did them, you know, we did them. We did as best as we could. We called them snap actions. We didn't call them national actions. It was like, you know, we've got 3 days to organize this. What can we do? So we did it. And, you know, and some of that was really successful because I think, I'm sure these other guests are going to talk about like what they were doing, but what we did was draw attention to the issue. And that was what Darren's role was in the DDA. We were never in the consultation. We never, you know, put like our demands to the leadership group. We were just focused on transport. Yeah. And I'm very proud of that because, you know, today we're going to talk about what went right and what went wrong with the DDA. But what I do know what went right is you have a lift and a bus.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you, Alan. That really demonstrates the power of kind of the voice of people, and actually that demonstration, how it raised the issue of the inequality. And you mentioned Oliver and the social model and making it a political issue. Absolutely. And so that, you know, all of this was happening, and there was obviously work going on about designing this legislation. So I just wanted to come to David and just kind of to ask you, as you talked about in the beginning, in those days, you were a lawyer, a solicitor. So kind of what were you doing at that time? And from your perspective at that time, did you see this legislation as it's often described as a landmark piece of legislation, disability rights, and kind of what was the impact of that law, and I suppose also including cultural change, really?
Yeah.
Sorry, can I interrupt a minute? I'm really sorry. We need to spotlight Sally, the interpreter. She's not showing at the moment, and can she go at the top, please? For some reason, I can't seem to spotlight her.
I think she is spotlighted.
She is spotlighted.
Right, she is now.
Speak of you.
Okay. Can Sylvia, it's you. And move her. Can we move her to the top?
We can't move them down.
Okay. Sylvia, hopefully you can at least see her.
Okay.
Okay. Pardon me.
David, sorry, carry
on. Sorry, I was just what I was doing at that time. So I was a relatively young lawyer, and I had, because I was born with my impairment, and in the 1960s and 70s, pretty much all disabled kids were sent to special schools. And I had been mostly in special schools, not only, but I'd left at 16 and had gone to a local regular comprehensive where my life changed. And the reason I say all of that, for the better, change for the better. And the reason I say all of that is because I became, partly through reading and reading lots of people, including Jenny Morris's book, Pride Against Prejudice, and others, I became very passionate about disability inclusion. And I decided to learn about education law, which at that time was a very small niche area of law. And so I started practicing in education law, a whole range of education law, but mostly representing disabled children and young people. And so that's what I was doing prior to the DDA. became, I guess, quite a specialist in the area, and that's the kind of work that legal drafting I did. In terms of your other question, Cameron, I remember at the time that a lot of activists weren't happy with the DDA because of its limitations at the time. And it was somewhat limited. It got amended over the years, and we might hear some more about that. And then later on, a Disability Rights Commission was introduced, which was tremendously important, and it was extended to educate schools and goods, services and facilities and transport provisions. Some transport provisions came in. But at the time, I thought it was a reasonable start, really. And it, in as much as it at least acknowledged that disability was a civil rights issue, it was a discrimination issue. And I think because of that, it began to change cultures. I remember at the time in the demonstrations, there was huge support for civil rights legislation. I think the public was ahead of the government, ahead of the Tory government at the time. And people sort of viscerally, or in their bones, sort of felt that it was unfair that disabled people couldn't remain part of the community, or that they couldn't get jobs, or that they would be excluded from social events because of lack of access, or a whole range of things. And I think because the law established non-discrimination and also critically the reasonable adjustments obligation, which was new in equality law then, the requirement that people had to do things differently in order for disabled people to be included. That began to play out in environments and cultures. And I think probably the next 5, 10, 15 years, I'm sure Agnes and others will be able to speak to this, saw a time when public bodies, education institutions and others really wanted to begin to understand better inclusion, disability as a rights issue, not just as a private medical tragedy or as a health condition or whatever. So I do personally think it was transformative.
Thank you. And absolutely, and I can agree, absolutely. At the time, it was transformative in that sense of just shifting how people thought about us as disabled people, but actually their obligations of what they had to do to bring about change. So and you mentioned, David, the Disability Rights Commission. Were you involved in that in any way?
I didn't work for them directly like Greg and Agnes and others. But I worked very closely with them. By then I was a partner in the law firm that I was where I worked. And I worked with them around developing codes of practice around particularly around education, but in other areas as well, and fitness to practice rules for social workers and nurses. And they also very helpfully funded me to take some cases, some key strategic litigation cases, particularly in the area of education of disabled children and young people, which I was lucky enough to be able to do.
And that's kind of sorely lacking at the moment, isn't it?
Yes.
An overall body doing that litigation. Coming to Agnes, so obviously you said you were at the DRC, so we'll come to that in a second, but I think you've also told me that you were involved in the Rights Now campaign. So I just wanted to kind of touch on, just tell us a bit more about what that was, and then how you found yourself at the DRC and what you were doing there.
So Alan's spoken a little bit about the Direct Action Network, but sort of campaigning and lobbying on disability rights was spread across a wide range of organisations, particularly disabled people's organisations. So at the time, in the early 1990s, there was the British Council of Organisations of Disabled People, an umbrella body, so very, very much in line with Disability Rights UK. But lots and lots of the older traditional charities, not controlled and run by disabled people, but purportedly for disabled people, were sort of slowly turning like super tankers, or whatever the analogy would be, towards the idea of legislation. And that took a long time in itself, and lots of the disability charities which relied on the great and the good and patronage and all of those things, initially went along very much with the government's approach of all that's needed is what was called education and persuasion. Everyone will be nice if we tell them how wonderful disabled people are, and suddenly disabled people will have jobs, and everything will change. So it took quite a lot of time to kind of work through that. And really what the Rights Now campaign finally managed to do, it was a coalition of over 80 different types of organisation, and that difference is really important. It included trade union bodies, it had support from the trade unions, it included individual disabled people's organisations, centres for independent living, but it also included a sort of smaller number, a handful really, of big disability national charities like the Royal National Institute for Deaf People, the Royal National Institute for the Blind, Radar, again, not an organisation of disabled people, absolutely not. Scope, which had just changed from being the Spastic Society. So there were these old charities, but they were staffed increasingly by, let's just say, sort of younger, but active people who were politically minded, whether or not they were disabled themselves, but they were engaged, they were politically active, and they managed to shift those disability charities. And even people like Bert Massey, who Alan mentioned, who was the chief executive of Radar at the time, became part of this broad coalition, which said, we've had since 1983, 13 or 14 attempts, private members, individual MPs trying to change the law, to bring in increasingly sophisticated, balanced, effective civil rights disabled people's bills. We then arrived at 1994 when the final one of those bills, which had, as David said, broad support from the media, really all aspects, the Sun, all aspects of the sort of broadsheet and tabloid media, a majority in the House of Commons, if you actually did a poll, and absolutely the support of the House of Lords. But then it was talked out by the Conservative government of the day. And in some ways, that was the final piece that sort of absolutely lit a sort of firework. The demonstrations in the summer of 1994, after that had happened, after kind of historic parliamentary tactics had talked out this treasured bill that had been worked on for so many years, that really represented rights for disabled people. It became a worldwide story for one reason and another. So, the activities of Dan, of the Direct Action Network, stopping the traffic, handcuffing ourselves to buses, it really got that attention, provided fantastic pictures for the front pages of newspapers, and in effect, pushed the then, teetering towards the end of its, lengthy time in government, Conservative government, to bring forward its own legislation, the Disability Discrimination Act, which was passed in 1995. So I hope you can tell the sort of the passion and the excitement. It was an amazing thing to be part of that, despite that kick in the teeth, to be working with disabled people with a common purpose to achieve this legislation. It was a glorious time, as well as a really sort of challenging time in terms of what happened.
Yeah.
Beyond that, just to come on to your second question, Cameron, what happened? Well, it's not as simple as, there were plenty of Conservative supporters of this legislation, but when Labour came in 1997, all sorts of things changed. I think there was a sense of optimism. Suddenly there was funding for a disability rights task force to look at the DDA and say, okay, we've got this principle of disability discrimination. We've changed the law through this idea of reasonable adjustment, but no employer with more than 20 employees is even troubled by it, because they were excluded. Fewer than 20 employees, they were excluded from it. Transport and education were not really dealt with in any significant way. And there was no enforcement body. So from 1997 onwards, there was legislation brought forward to improve on the DDA, and then the establishment of the Disability Rights Commission, which opened for business in 2000. And I had the pleasure and the privilege of working there for 6 years. It was only around for 7. I was there till the end with Greg as well. And it wasn't a DPO, it was a public body. It was funded entirely by government, but it had a strategy of funding significant legal cases to explore and really expand on the law, of supporting individual pieces of litigation as well, of communicating with people about their rights. You might not understand, you might not describe yourself as disabled, but you actually have rights in the workplace. And if you need some help, here's a helpline, and they can talk you through what you're entitled to. And then the final piece, particularly towards the end of the Disability Rights Commission, was bringing aside a legal strategy and a communications and strategy with an influencing strategy. And that was all about saying, getting things right for disabled people is often at the heart of effective government policy. Put disability equality at the heart of your employment strategy, at the heart of your transport strategy, your education strategy, your health and your social care strategy, and you will solve many of the challenges that face you. So it was those three elements of legal, of communication, and of influencing policy, which for a very brief hour, brief moment, because it was a relatively short-lived organisation, I felt really began to have some impact.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to you, Greg. So Greg, you said you were at the DRC as well at a similar time to when Agnes was there. I just wanted to ask you, so when you joined, what you mentioned, I think you were director of strategy, you said in your opening, what did that involve? And I guess my question was, where do you think the DRC was most effective and why?
So when I joined the DRC, as I said previously, I hadn't really been involved in the disability rights movement prior to that. In fact, I had no friends that saw themselves as disabled. And like David, I spent some of my education in a special needs school. And I refused to be pitied and avoided seeing myself as a disabled person until probably my late 20s. But anyone seeing me, obviously I was, so it was quite ridiculous. But that was the stigma that I tried to avoid. But I think the DDA changed that, and I think it was a long time ago. But I think there was a change in that more disabled people had to identify themselves as disabled people and see themselves as part of that movement. So when I saw that, so I was working in the .com industry at that time, which all went, or the .com boom, but the boom went bust in the early noughties. So I was unemployed. So I saw the DDA advert. I applied for it. Didn't think I'd get it, but I think I applied for it because I just wanted to give back something to my fellow people, like my fellow panelists that had done so much in the 80s and 90s to get the DDA through. And the DRC had been going about a year or two. I think it was 2 years before I joined. So it'd taken quite a long time to ramp up. It was a significant organization. It was 250 people, a budget of about 23 million, which would nowadays be about 40. So significant resources to manage. And my job was basically herd the cats into having a cohesive strategy for the organization. And we had sort of set 3-year cycles in terms of getting strategy signed off because we did have to get the strategy signed off, obviously not just by the commissioners, but also the Department of Work and Pensions that funded it, and the Secretary of State, whoever that was at the time.
Yeah, and what I guess, why do you think it was so effective in the short period that it kind of?
I think one was it was very focused. So it was very focused on the aspects of the individual sections of the DDA. in terms of employment, education, goods and services and transport, and to some extent health and social services, social care. So it was very focused. We had very specific ambitions that not just the DRC but the government could influence. So within the strategy there was a sort of 10-year ambition, which is the overarching ambition, which was saying employment was reducing the employment rate gap, and also reducing the employment rate salary rate gap. So there was that overarching ambition and very clear objectives for the whole of the DRC, sort of at a lower level to try and get to that longer term objective. And we had that for each of the strands, and we had the ability to because, as Agnes said, we had all these different powers around employment, awareness raising, conciliation, the helpline, which some of the other commissions didn't have. We were able to vary those, and we varied those according to those different strands of transport and employment and education, depending on where we were in terms of implementing the legislation and what the compliance was at that time of the legislation. So, for instance, in terms of when we were implementing Part 3, we had a huge campaign around what is called Open for All, where we focused on awareness raising for business in terms of accessibility. We got some criticism for that, and in that we weren't talking so much to disabled people, but we had to prioritize on who we were communicating with at a certain time. And I think that was very key, that sort of prioritization, which was at quite a granular level.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I wonder if we can just pin everybody else back in, please, just so we can close this bit off. We could probably, I know we could talk a lot longer about this because it's fascinating. I think it's really important for us to remember our history and kind of what people did before us, and where we are today as a result of what happened at that point. And actually, today we often talk about hard fought won rights, so things that disabled people have had to fight for to get rights, and how easy it is to lose them. And it really feels at the moment that in the UK, certainly, there's a huge amount of attack on disabled people and our rights, our right to independence, our right to be seen, our right to be supported. We're seeing, decision after decision from the Labour government. We all hoped that after 14 years we'd have a different kind of experience, but it doesn't feel like that at the moment, certainly. So thank you for your time. It's been wonderful connecting with David and Alan, who I've not spoken to before. Thank you for giving your time. Agnes and Greg, I've known you for a while, quite many years, but we've never talked about this. So it's been lovely hearing some of your experiences of that time. And I hope for people who are listening, whether you're an activist or whether you're not an activist but involved in other ways, or you have just an interest in this topic, the fight goes on. It's not, we're certainly not at the point where we've all got inclusive lives and rights are there. And so thank you very much to all of you. Hopefully we'll talk about this topic again. We won't leave it another 30 years. So thank you very much from all of us. We're going to move on to talk about some work that Disability Rights UK is involved in with some other colleagues of ours on this idea of a UK Accessibility Act. And I'd like to invite Professor Anna Lawson and Kathy Casey to join me. And really, I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves and then hand over to them to present the work that they and others have been doing on this idea of a UK Accessibility Act, to introduce it, talk about it, and then after that, straight from that, we'll go into some breakout rooms as well. So hello, Kathy. We can see you. We'll just wait for Anna to join us as well. How are you,
No,
Kathy?
I'm sorry, I can't turn my video on for some
All right,
reason.
we can hear you.
Sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry. Don't worry. As long as we can hear you, that's really
Yeah.
important. So I'm going to hand over to both of you and kind of allow you to tell us about the work you've been doing.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and to have heard that great panel discussion. My name's Catherine Casserly. I'm a barrister at Cloisters Chambers, specialising in discrimination, equality, employment, human rights law. I've got a fairly long history working in disability and discrimination law, which I won't bore you with. But I'm here today speaking with Professor Anna Lawson, and I'm going to talk a bit about the Equality Act and the case for change, and then I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to talk about the UK Accessibility Act. As we've heard, and as I suspect those of you who are familiar with the Disability Discrimination Act and its coming into law will appreciate it. It was indeed a transformative piece of legislation. I was able to work with it both in my time at RNIB, the super tanker as it was at the time, I think Agnes said, and I also had the privilege of working at the Disability Rights Commission using the amended Disability Discrimination Act as well. And both the DDA and indeed the Equality Act have delivered some really significant changes, I think, for disabled people. They've been used in campaigning as well as some really significant victories, both in court and out. Poorly in First Bus, for example, the Supreme Court case about priority for the wheelchair space on the bus, challenges to government on its disability strategy, and indeed on the closure of the Independent Living Fund, although that was only successful first time round. However, despite the improvements that have been made to the Disability Discrimination Act over the years, and then subsequently to the Equality Act, to the disability provisions and specifically in the Equality Act, there remain some very significant flaws. In terms of the content and the reach of the Equality Act, as those of you who are familiar with its basic provisions will know, there is an anticipatory duty to make reasonable adjustments in relation to services and education. And that means that service providers and others who are subject to that duty have to consider and make changes for disabled people in advance. And that is fairly far-reaching. As David said, I think, it's the first reasonable adjustment duty in and of itself was a first in the law, and having anticipatory duty was even more far-reaching. But it's limited by what is reasonable, and that isn't defined anywhere and has to be approached on a case-by-case basis. The public sector equality duty, which again is incredibly far-reaching and has been useful both in campaigning and in legal cases, is limited by due regard. And in fact, the courts have been clear that that is a duty of process and not outcome. And I think that's clear when you think about the Independent Living Fund case, which was successful at first, but then when it was brought before the courts again, it was unsuccessful. In addition, cases rely on individuals having to take legal action in relation, for example, to a failure to comply with the anticipatory reasonable adjustment duty. Further, the Equality Act is limited in housing, so there's no duty to alter physical features. And again, in pre-16 education, there is also no duty to alter physical features of premises. When it comes to manufactured goods, they aren't addressed at all in the current legislation. There are limited accessibility standards. So, for example, there are particular provisions for transport vehicles and for public body websites, but those aren't always easy to enforce and they can be quite confusing. So overall, the content of the Act that we have at the moment isn't sufficient to drive a systemic proactive approach to achieving accessibility. But I think the most significant flaw, in my view, is when it comes to enforcement. So the anticipatory duty is critical, I think, to disability equality. And it was a really fundamental part of the services provisions of the Equality Act. But as I've already said, it relies on individuals to enforce it. And that's in a legal system which is adversarial. So you're relying on parties arguing, and it's whoever wins, and that's the end of the case. There is cost to that, and an awful lot of difficulty for disabled people, particularly if they're representing themselves. There's limited advice available in a very complex area of law. And if you lose a claim in the county court, or if you're dealing with a services or a functions case, you risk, or you risk having it struck out at an early stage. Then you run the risk of significant costs having to be paid. And when it comes to what the courts can do, if you win a claim, the focus is on money, particularly in the employment sphere. That's also the case in county courts, although the county courts can order barriers to be removed. The focus is very much, though, on the individual case. So, for example, in the employment sphere, you can get a recommendation that something be done, but it's only if you're still employed. And in the county court, if you ask for an injunction, it's very much tied to the individual case. It's not about removing the broader barrier. So what this results in is a very piecemeal approach. What you're doing is tackling one barrier at a time, unless you have a rare case where either through settlement or enforcement, organisation-wide change is achieved. And so as a result, those of us who've been working in this area consider that this is time to consider a UK Accessibility Act to address these flaws and to drive that change. And so at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Professor Anna Lawson, who's going to talk about that some more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So I'm Anna Lawson. I'm a Professor of Law at the University of Leeds and a member of the Centre for Disability Studies there. And I'm blind. And for that reason, I'd be really grateful if maybe you could just keep the chat to a minimum, because I can hear it. I can't hear my notes when the chat is on. So yeah, obviously for vital things, please go ahead. But if you could keep the unnecessary chat down, that would be lovely. So I'm one of the, like Kathy, my area is disability law, equality law and human rights. And I've been working with Kathy and with people from Disability Rights UK and others on this idea of a UK Accessibility Act, and just thinking through whether we need it and what it might look like. And it's very exciting to be talking to you all about it today. So our thinking is that we do need a UK Accessibility Act, not to replace the Equality Act or the Disability Discrimination Act in Northern Ireland, as it still is, but to sit alongside our equality law. We need this because it would help the UK comply with its obligations in international law, in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 9 of which is on accessibility, and the UN committee that oversees that treaty has given very clear guidance on what Article 9 means. And it means the type of proactive systemic approach that Kathy spoke of, that isn't limited by concepts like reasonable and due regard. It's working towards accessibility over time in accordance with a strategy which has clear milestones, it's monitored, and it's not limited by concepts like due regard and reasonable. More importantly than needing it to meet our international human rights obligations, we need it because it would make a difference to our lives. The progress towards accessibility has been slow, and it's patchy. It's not always forward going. That goes for the built environment, transport, housing, streets, technology, white goods, etc., etc. So a UK Accessibility Act could make a difference. In pushing for it, we wouldn't be alone. We wouldn't be making this claim for the first time. In Canada, disabled people have campaigned successfully for an Accessible Canada Act, very much a bottom-up grassroots initiative. There's also the EU Accessibility Act, which we missed out on because of Brexit. That applies to manufactured goods, which, as Cathy mentioned, our equality law doesn't cover. So what could a UK Accessibility Act include? What could it look like? I'm going to use the rest of my time to talk about this and draw especially on some of the ideas that are in the Accessible Canada Act. So first, it should include a legislative commitment to making the UK accessible by a specified date. The Accessible Canada Act has 2040. We might want to think about that, or perhaps a little later. And there should be a clear government responsibility to make that happen in that time frame. There would need to be clear governmental leadership, and that should happen through some kind of post, like a Minister for Accessibility. That minister should have oversight of progress towards that ultimate goal of making the UK accessible by the specified date. So they should oversee progress towards that end, and therefore make sure the strategy is working, that milestones are complied with, that we're on track. And that minister should also have the power to introduce regulations that would create obligations that would supplement the ones in the Act itself, because this is an area where you can't do everything all in one go. There's going to be a need for some obligations to be introduced after the initial Act is passed. So the Act should make provision for three main types of obligation. First, accessibility standards. So yes, we have standards already, but we don't have a system for creating accessibility standards like there is in Canada now, and as there has been in the United States, for example, for a long time through the US Access Board. So these standards would be drawn up by a new body the Act would create, called something like a UK Accessibility Standards Board, and that should have a majority involvement of disabled people's organisations and operate with the full involvement of disabled people. The standards themselves should be drawn up with full involvement of disabled people, lots of opportunity to feed in, and they should be publicly available. Most of our standards aren't. They're very difficult to get hold of. You often have to pay a fortune to get them. And there should be awareness raising efforts linked to them as well, as there is. The US Access Board has been very good at raising awareness of what the implications of accessibility standards are. Second, so we need accessibility standards that are binding. Second, the second type of obligation is an obligation on particular types of organisation or sector to produce accessibility strategies or plans. And these should be drawn up with the involvement of disabled people, and they should be publicly available, and there should, like in the Accessible Canada Act, be an obligation to publish progress updates on implementing those plans. The third type of obligation, there should be obligations on certain types of organisation or body, like manufacturers, to publish information about accessibility. So it might be that before you have an accessibility standard in a relevant area, you might want something like an obligation to publish information about the accessibility of a particular type of product, so that we know whether what we're buying is accessible or not before we spend money on it, and then can't take it back. So those are types of obligation it might include. The Act should also establish, it's critical that it establishes strong monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. So we need to think about establishing an accessibility commissioner, as they have in Canada, or an accessibility ombud office. And that body should have a role in monitoring, should be involved in the monitoring of progress towards accessibility and the implementation of these obligations, and be able and liaise with the Minister for Accessibility in that regard. And they should have a means of proactive enforcement. So if they find that there are breaches through the monitoring they do, they should have proactive powers to enforce the obligations and impose penalties. And they should also be able to receive individual complaints about breaches, and these should be for no cost or very low cost, unlike the current system which Cathy described. And the focus of these hearings should be on compliance, not on damages for individuals. Individuals should still be able to bring their Equality Act claims if they prefer. So that's just a brief kind of sketch about what an Accessibility Act could look like, should look like. The details of it would obviously need to be thought through more fully, with more involvement from people like you. There would need to be lots of consultation. But these are just some ideas of key elements that should feature to bring about, I can't resist this phrase, the step change. Sorry about that. The step change we need in progress towards accessibility. As we've been hearing, it's 30 years since we had the Disability Discrimination Act, and since all the amazing energy, effort, ingenuity that was put into that campaign for that legislation. That legislation remains critically important, but it's become clear, 3 decades have made it clear that it's not enough on its own to make the UK accessible. For that, a vital first step is a new law, a UK Accessibility Act. Disabled people in other countries have fought for that successfully, and so can we. As we heard earlier, we have the passion, the excitement, the ingenuity, the dedication that's needed to bring about this kind of change, and now's the time. We think. We're now looking forward to hearing what you think, and hopefully building lots of coalitions around this idea.